Aloha, and welcome to Feast, Dish, and Dialogue, a podcast presented by the Hawaii Ag and Culinary Alliance, sharing conversations from the Feast Summit at the annual Hawaii Food and Wine Festival. Here, leaders across food, education, agriculture, sustainability, and tourism come together to explore the future of food systems and hospitality, and how culinary sits at the center of the visitor experience in Hawaii and beyond. In this Feast Dish episode, we feature keynote speaker Sherman, the James Beard Award-winning founder of NATIFS and one of the leading voices in the Indigenous food movement from the Feast Summit stage. Recorded live at the summit in a session presented by Kamehameha Schools, Sherman shares how he reclaims and celebrates native food systems, using cuisine to heal, educate, and empower communities.
All right, aloha. Haumatakepe, wambili watakepe nichiape. So my name is Sherman. I come from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, in Minneapolis. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota tribe. So I currently live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I give this talk quite a bit all over the place, and I'm going to go through it really fast because usually this talk's about an hour long, and I'm going to squish it into 20 minutes. So bear with me. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to move through some things pretty quickly, but there's a lot of information I want to share with you guys about the work that we do. If you're not familiar with what Pine Ridge is the third largest reservation in the United States. So this story will just basically be my perspective as an Indigenous person coming from North America, especially in the United States. And so Pine Ridge, it's a pretty large area. It's about the size of Connecticut. The last treaty we had with the United States government was in 1868, which was the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which had granted us all of that space in red around the current reservation, which is the part in yellow. But once they discovered gold in 1876, all those treaties were out the window pretty quickly. As Lakota, we were still fighting the U.S. government up until the turn of the century, because Wounded Knee Massacre doesn't happen until 1890, and we still had some skirmishes shortly after that. So it's a very short history for our struggles with the colonizers and where I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation. So for myself, I was born into the restaurant industry, basically, because my mom moved us off the res. Like on the reservation, we didn't have restaurants. We had one grocery store to service that area the size of Connecticut. We didn't really have access to healthy food. We didn't have our own food particularly because we had been moved, because reservations are still segregated communities in the United States today. And so when I became a young chef working in restaurants at the age of 13, moving on, I just continued to work restaurants through high school, college, and became a young chef in the city of Minneapolis. Minneapolis is in Minnesota. We're almost Canadian, but not quite. And it's just, the land of I didn't really know much about Minneapolis except for that's where Prince and the Replacements came from. But it turned out to be a pretty cool city. And, we've made a pretty good home there. We have a restaurant there that I'll talk a little bit about. And so when I moved to Minneapolis and continued my path in the restaurant industry and became a young chef in my 20s, there was a point where I just realized the complete absence of Indigenous foods out there. And so there were no native restaurants. There was very few books on the concept, and there just wasn't anything that represented my culture. And I realized myself I didn't know much about my own heritage, even though it hadn't been that long generationally of when we lost stuff. And if you guys can't see the screen, you might want to move over just a little bit because there's a lot of cool slides on here. And anyways, so I started just thinking about what the hell happened to our native foods? Why don't we have native restaurants everywhere? Why, we're in Native America, so why aren't there Native American restaurants on every corner, in every city, in every region? And it's still very rare to find a native restaurant out there in the world. So it set me on a path to try to understand what were my ancestors eating, what were we harvesting, how were just culinary questions, what did we use for fats and salts and sugars, what was our knowledge of plants and how did we identify things? And there was so many questions I had from that culinary perspective. So it shot me on a path to understand what were pre-colonial foods, and I started practicing it, just doing dinners with pre-colonial ingredients, making pre-colonial and, this just Indigenous focused foods. And I created a philosophy of basically, in order to highlight and showcase modern Indigenous foods, I just cut out colonial ingredients. I took away things that were introduced to us. So I removed wheat flour, dairy products, cane sugar, beef, pork, chicken, just really focused on what was native, with native agriculture, agricultural products, wild foods, wild game, birds, fish, all the things. And so, but it also sent me on a path to explain like what were Native American foods, because people living on Native America didn't really know what Native American foods were. And even on tribal communities, like we lost so much of our knowledge around our foodways. So I had to learn how to explain it and articulate it. So I like to start from the very beginning of just like what does it mean to decolonize? What are pre-colonial foods? Why is colonization bad? You know. So in order to understand colonialism, the easiest way to understand it is just to Google it. So if you Google the word colonialism, you get this situation, this description, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, exploiting it economically. Obviously, this hasn't happened. This isn't a story unique to North America, because colonizations happen across the globe. It's happened here. It's happened in Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, India, Africa, South America, all over the globe, right? And a lot of it's coming from Eurocentric powers. So I just like to go through a brief history of colonization in the Americas, because that's where I grew up and that's what affected me. That's also the reason why we don't have Native American restaurants all over the place. You know, so American history is very short, because like, you know, as a young country, like we're not even born until the late 1700s as the United States of America. And no matter where we are on American soil, like we're Native American history is there first, right? Even though our histories are wiped away oftentimes. But in the US, like, you know, the reality, like during that time period of the very first forming, you know, even just barely a few years before Captain Cook discovers, like over here, right? There's so much. There's like the reality is like the majority of this land space is occupied and stewarded by Indigenous peoples. Many Indigenous peoples hadn't even seen European peoples around the year 1800, which is an ancient history, right? And so, like in the United States, we don't even really define our southern borders and northern borders until the middle of that century, until the treaty or to Louisiana Purchase happens in 1804. Which takes a big chunk of space, and then the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo officially forms that southern border in 1848, which is again middle of that century. And so people have to remember like how quickly Indigenous peoples lose control over land space because of, you know, introducing the concept of buying lands and owning land and land ownership and pieces like that.
You're listening to Feast, Dish and Dialogue, conversations from the Feast Summit exploring how food, culture, and hospitality shape the visitor experience in Hawaii and beyond.
Still today in the continental United States, 98% of privatized land ownership is still under white control. It's a direct result from the colonization that happened during that time period. You know, so as Indigenous peoples, like we go from over 80% to less than 2% within a single century, just because of reservation systems, because of the violence that was happening. Places like California wipe out its entire Indigenous population almost to completion within 2 decades, between 1850 and 1860. They do a census in 1873, and there's less than 14,000 people left alive after hundreds of thousands of them before at the beginning of that century, because they had legalized bounty systems where you can make upwards to $5 for the body part of an Indigenous person, and if you do the inflation of what was $5 in 1850, like it's a shit ton of money. It's like almost $300, and all that money was being paid out by the newly formed state of California, which was reimbursed to them by the United States government. So it's state and federally sponsored genocide during those time periods. So as Indigenous peoples, we were demonized right off the bat because they call us merciless Indian savages in the breakup letter with King George, which is also known as the Declaration of Independence. We see other things like the Northwest Ordinance, which basically justifies land ownership and strips land ownership away from Indigenous peoples and enables U.S. government to parcel out land ownership and sell it, and they make a shit ton of money during that time period. So when you're flying over the United States and look out your window and you see those perfect little grids, that's a direct result of the Northwest Ordinance. We also see things like the Indian Removal Act, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act of 1862, which creates land grant universities, which should be called land grab universities, and the Dawes Act of 1887, and those are just examples of all of this legislation being passed through the United States government to further weaken Indigenous peoples and to take over land spaces that wasn't theirs to begin with. So for us as Indigenous peoples, we saw a massive amount of loss of our own food access because of the loss of the land, because we were the original stewards of the land. We had the blueprint to live sustainably on the land like Indigenous peoples did globally. And so for us, like this was a very difficult thing because their entire world changes in a very short time period within basically a single generation. And it's very focused on, it's very focused. The United States government knows exactly what they're doing, and it creates this situation. And what really hurt us was the loss of our education programming. And so for Indigenous education, that's countless generations of knowledge being passed down to us as Indigenous peoples to give us the blueprint to live sustainably no matter where we are in the world, but especially just all of those traditions of understanding foods and plants and animals and cooking techniques and food preservation techniques, traditions, prayers, whatever it is, like all of that stripped away because of assimilation efforts. So my grandparents' generation, first generation of Indigenous students, especially on Pine Ridge, to have to go through like changing their language, changing their religion, having to learn Christianity and English, and being stripped away of everything that it meant to be Lakota. And so this assimilation, was just, was fake, because they're saying like, look how we're civilizing these young Indigenous peoples, but actually you're just layering on an immense amount of trauma that we're still reeling from today, because we're still facing a lot of, mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, death, and all this violence that still happens amongst some of our communities because of this trauma that was dealt to this young generation, which was my grandparents' generation for me. I had a lot of family members that go through these boarding schools, starting in Pennsylvania in the United States. But these boarding schools, of course, pop up all over what is the continental U.S., the territories at the time, and also in Canada, they're called residential schools, and they're mostly religious in Canada, where they were more military in the United States. But again, this is a really awful timeline for Indigenous peoples that strips us of so much of what it meant to be Indigenous and really kind of sets us off track, And so the Indigenous experience in the 1900s doesn't get much better for us, because in the United States, we couldn't even be citizens until 1924. They also had to create the Racial Integrity Act to reclassify us, so we just were considered colored people during that time period. We go through a couple decades of Indian termination relocation policies. We also go through 3 decades of Indian adoption era, that's called, where the statistic is 1 out of 3 Native babies in the U.S. are pulled from the hospitals, literally from their moms, and put into adoption services, which was another form of cultural genocide for us as Indigenous peoples. We can't vote until 1965 like most people of color, and we still have a hard time voting because everything's gerrymandered, and they don't want Native votes out there. And we can't even celebrate our own religions officially until 1978 without the fear of prosecution, getting thrown into jail, death, like all those things were real, and a lot of our cultures were driven into secrecy during those time periods. So growing up in post-colonial Native America, as a chef, people are all like, you're a Native chef. What did you eat growing up? Because they want to hear a cool story of how I'd take down a bear in the morning, process it, grab some berries along the way, have a big community feast. But like, I grew up in a colonized state. My Lakota food looked like this. Like, we grew up with processed meats and white bread and shit that had nothing to do with us as Lakota people, right? And we were very poor, because Pine Ridge, when I was growing up, was over 90% unemployment. It's above 70% unemployment still today. And so like things weren't great, and we grew up with commodity food programs largely, and like we just had shit like beef with juices, and like it's that with juices that really makes that product, right? And so so understanding Indigenous food systems is really important, because there's so much across the globe that we can learn from Indigenous peoples, because again, we had the blueprint to live sustainably everywhere. So we have to understand, because understanding Indigenous peoples is understanding Indigenous diversity. We're not one Indian, like we have so much countless just diversity, and we should be celebrating that by diversity, because there's so much diversity just across some place like North America. And if you blur the lines of Mexico and US and Canada and look at Indigenous peoples, you see massive diversity. And it doesn't matter if we're speaking English, Spanish, or French, because those are all colonial languages. English is a foreign language on US soil. And so we just have to remember those simple facts, right? So for Indigenous education, we should really start to really push and teach about our Indigenous education, which is a whole bunch of things, all of these things: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting techniques, land stewardship, cooking techniques, metallurgy, Indigenous histories, star knowledge, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, because there's no reason for Eurocentrism to be the pinpoint of everything, for education, for agriculture, for food systems, for all of this stuff. Like, as Indigenous peoples, we have such valuable knowledge that we should be pulling out and celebrating and readopting in today's world. So Indigenous culinary knowledge, we should really be considering, like, what does it mean, what does Indigenous culinary mean moving forward, and how can we really, put that into play moving forward. So for us, like growing up, proteins is an easy piece as chefs because literally any animal moving can be protein if you want it to be, you know. I don't suggest that for everything, but it's very possible. So we shouldn't be afraid of things, of not eating cows, pigs, and chickens in the U.S. because those animals were adopted. They weren't from there, and they hadn't even been there that long, you know. So like we would just look at things like what were indigenous to North America and just use all of that stuff. And I'll talk about this, but this book comes out in just a couple of weeks, and this has everything from like javelina, whale, seal, all sorts of protein diversity, just because that's the true foods of North America.
Feast, Dish and Dialogue is presented by the Hawaii Ag and Culinary Alliance, the nonprofit organization behind the Hawaii Food and Wine Festival. Founded to strengthen Hawaii's culinary and agricultural industries, HACA connects world-class culinary events with year-round investment in education, workforce development, and local agriculture. Through programs that support students, entrepreneurs, farmers, and hospitality professionals, HACA works to ensure Hawaii's food and hospitality ecosystem continues to grow, innovate, and thrive.
You know, and there's so much to explore when it comes to proteins, and that's an easy part. And even insects, like we have insects on our menu. Many communities eat insects all over the place because they're healthy proteins, and you can make them taste good, you know. And we don't have to be stuck in the past. We don't have to try to make foods taste like the past. Try to make foods taste like the future, like what we want it to be, because we have the ability to evolve every single day that we're alive, and we should be focused on that evolution. And having plant knowledge is massive, because the more we understand our plant families, where they come from, the importance that it had to our cultures, the more we really connect with our ancestors too. And we have new plants around us because we're in a new world today than our ancestors were. So there's new plants that we can adopt into our diets, because there's a lot of things that are invasive that are actually healthy for us, that could be good for us if we just know how to utilize them and tend to them properly and care for them. And just understanding, like, where did we get things like carbs and fats and all these things that we need to get energy as humans, you know, and how did we have a balanced diet? And so for us, like, there's so many cool things out there when it comes to plants, because plants give us everything. It's food, it's lodging, it's crafting, it's tools, it's weapons, it's all sorts of stuff that plants give us. And we need that education back, you know, because I always tease that our kids can name more Kardashians than they can tree species, you know, because, like, what kind of education are we giving our youth today, right? And so, like, there's just so much to learn. And agriculture is massive because indigenous peoples created agriculture all over the place, you know. And in the U.S., like, you know, we're taught we're at this kind of massive industrial agriculture, that this is the pinnacle of it. But it's not, because we have a lot to learn. Like, we're damaging soils. We're poisoning our waters and doing all these things that this monocrop style, this GMO style of agriculture is not the way forward for the future. You know, if you see things like, should we be worried that glyphosate was found in your Cheerios? Like, yes. Like, you guys have all been microdosing glyphosate for a while now. You're going to figure out what that's going to do to you pretty soon, unfortunately. But in the U.S., like, agriculture was massively widespread, growing things like corns and beans and squash in massive communities, you know, like the Mayan. There's still over 1 million Mayan speakers left today. It's not a past civilization. They're still very much alive out there, you know, despite what our history books try to tell us, right? And they figured out massive ways to grow huge amounts of agriculture for massive civilizations, you know, because like Tenochtitlan, where today Mexico City is, there was hundreds of thousands of peoples living there with a completely organic farming agricultural system to feed people massively. And people had to figure out, you know, how to farm in the middle of the desert, you know, or coastal regions. And there's all of these methods of farming technique that came out of North America that we should be very proud of. And all these seeds that need to be protected because they're also at risk and in danger of being bought up by larger corporations that just want to control your food systems. And we need to be protecting that diversity of foods, because that's another connection to our ancestry. And we should really be pushing for more community gardens, more permaculture, just putting plants and food plants literally everywhere we can, you know, because lawns are fucking stupid. Like, we need to really focus on what's important and not just like waste space and waste time, you know. So for me, like, I created, you know, from all of this information, I created what's called Feast, which is, you know, works with this particular conference. But, you know, it's a recipe for decolonization, because for me, it breaks down as that certain steps to really get towards decolonization is really truly understanding food sovereignty, and that it is possible, and making food production more communal and really supporting our community and understanding where our food dollars are going directly. Educational sovereignty, of breaking away from Eurocentric and government-run educational systems and really focusing on what's important to us culturally and regionally.
If today's conversation inspires you, we invite you to experience it in person at the Feast Summit, returning Thursday, November 5th, 2026 in Honolulu during the 16th Annual Hawaii Food and Wine Festival. Mark your calendars, tickets go on sale this May. Learn more at hawaiifoodandwinefestival.com.
Taking the action to actually do those steps and just moving forward and just being the role models to do that stuff. Solidarity, meaning bringing together everybody that's faced hardships throughout the history of colonization globally. So in the U.S., it's immigrants, Black, Indigenous, people of color in general, everybody. We need to be coming together and celebrating and working together, and that's a part of that. And then transformation is actually seeing all of those things apply and becoming the new norm. There should be normal to see Native American and Indigenous-focused restaurants and culinary concepts everywhere. Make that the new norm, So like places like where we are, like almost 90% of the food is outsourced, and we can do better by pushing food dollars towards local producers and really activating land spaces. And we can do the same thing in tribal communities all over the United States and all over the globe, Because Indigenous communities had so much value when it came to understanding how food systems work, and we really need to return those values back to our Indigenous communities especially, and strengthen them and show our next generation the importance of being Indigenous and how it's up to them to lead that for the next generation and empowering them. So that's a big part of the work that we do with my nonprofit, which is NATIFS, or North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. We created a situation called Indigenous Food Lab, which we really focus on creating a native market where we have over 80 Indigenous producers already amongst ourselves that we're featuring and promoting and selling all over the place online. We have production kitchens to make more products. We have an education studio. We have over 200 videos on our Indigenous Food Lab YouTube channel already, including some from out here because we're really focused on Indigenous knowledge everywhere. We're really working on a lot of Indigenous food developments because our restaurant Awamni, which again is gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, we were still able to win Best Restaurant in the U.S. without ranch dressing a couple of years ago, which is pretty huge. Right? And and we're also working on institutional food manufacturing of just making larger format foods to get to schools and hospitals, and really pushing people to consider where their food dollars are going. Because if you're just buying everything blindly from a Walmart, Sysco, Aramark, U.S. Foods, or whatever, like who are you really supporting? Because how you purchase your foods is how you're voting for the future, right? So our goal is to, we finished this model in Minnesota, but we're actively growing. We're getting ready to move into Bozeman, Montana, into the Dakotas, into Alaska, and eventually we're going to start to pinpoint all over the U.S., and we'd love to be out this way also, because eventually we can cross colonial borders and be places like Canada, Mexico, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere we can to help Indigenous peoples. And I don't even have to do that in my lifetime. We're just trying to kick open doors for the next generation. And so for us, we can decolonize the world, but we can do it together. And the future will be Indigenous, but we have to work together. And again, I put a lot of effort into this, but this looks at North America without colonial borders from Mexico through Alaska and showcases all the amazing regional Indigenous diversity. So there's a lot of history baked into this. This book will probably be banned in Florida, which I'm fine with, because if you're not being banned in Florida, then what the fuck are you doing with your life, And so buy this on November 11th when it comes out. That's my PowerPoint, 20 minutes.
Mahalo for listening to Feast, Dish, and Dialogue. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe and share it with someone passionate about food, agriculture, and hospitality. To learn more about the Feast Summit and the Hawaii Food and Wine Festival, visit hawaiifoodandwinefestival.com. Be sure to join us for the next episode of Feast, Dish, and Dialogue.